Hello, welcome to the section entitled Launching a Compute Engine Instance with Custom Network Configuration, Internal IP Addresses, Google Private Access, Static and External Private IP Addresses, and Network Tags. So we already addressed network tags in the previous video related to firewall rules, so we won't cover that. Okay, so far, whenever we've created GCE instances, VMs, they've come with both private internal IP addresses and external IP addresses. And so in this section, we'll examine how to make an instance only have an internal IP address, and then explore some of the implications of that, and then some remediations of that. So let's start off with creating an instance. So instance, I'm going to put it in US Central 1. So where's US Central 1? Everything default. I'm going to make one change in the security setup here. I'm going to allow access to Google, all the APIs, because I wanted to validate access to these APIs once I have an external, no public IP address. So I'm going to enable that. And then I'm going to go underneath networking. So this is the new thing. And under network interface, you'll see there's an option here for external IP. I'm going to set that to none, right? And before I did that, I did want to make one observation here. Under this network tier, this has to do with how your instance is able to connect to the internet. And I think just a quick sidebar on this, I'm going to switch back to this. So there's two modes. When your instance is trying to talk to, say, an end user, right? If you're using the premium tier, what happens is your traffic basically traverses the global Google network to a point of presence that's close to the user, and you have a much more predictable communication path between your instance and the end user when you're using the internet, or when you have a public IP address. And so that's the premium tier benefit, which is a little bit more expensive. The standard tier is more like a traditional cloud provider, where Google will have your box will be here running in Google's platform, and they'll connect to a point of presence that's close to their data center in your region. And then you traverse the public internet to the end user. So again, the downside of this is it's less predictable, presumably slower, but the benefit is it's cheaper. So that's that distinction between the premium and standard tier when you saw that option here. And by default, it was set to premium. But I'm going to set it to internal, no external IP address, which means that's no longer relevant because you don't have a public IP address to route your traffic through. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to do. And I'm going to hit the create. And this will take a minute, so I'm going to pause the video for a second until this gets created. Okay, I'm back. So the instance is up, and let's click on the details of it because so you can get into it. And you'll see where it has under public IP address, network interfaces, there is internal IP address, but there's no external IP, right? And previously, we would be able to secure shell into the instance using the external IP, which we don't have right now. So what we can do instead, just to troubleshoot stuff, we can actually, if you just pull down here, there's a view gcloud command. So you can run this command, which will use Google's the gcloud command, basically to tunnel your traffic through the Google's network, and then you can actually talk to, you can connect to your box. So let me copy this command and paste it here. Again, we don't have direct access to our box using just direct shell, a secure shell, but you can log in your box this way. Okay, so I'm in my box, and a couple things you will notice here is, first of all, I should not have access to the internet because I don't have a public IP. So CNN, Google. Okay, this should time out, and it is. So one, you don't have access, and that's expected. One thing that's less expected is if I try to run some commands that interact with the Google APIs, which are public, and we're observing that that's not working either. So that's your first problem. You can't, you don't have access to the internet, and you can't access the Google APIs, which is so like you can't do updates on your box, and you can't like talk to Google. So those are two problems that we're going to overcome using some tools. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we'll show you how you can gain access to the Google APIs using a tool called Google Private Access. So I'll just demonstrate by example. So hit close. So I'm not going to do anything to my instance. I'm going to actually go to my VPC. Excuse me. So, pardon me 1 second. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm back. So here's my default network. I know my instance is running in US Central 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to US Central 1 and click on it. And I'm going to edit, and you'll see a little checkbox, Google Private Access. So what this is going to do is only in this region, in this subnet actually, any instances in the subnet will be able to talk to the Google APIs, because Google essentially has inserted a private way for when you route to the internet, instead of failing going to the internet, what will happen is it'll actually route, the route's still there, it'll actually route it to Google's APIs when you're making an API call. So I'll just turn this on. It's going to take, it's updating. I forget how long this doesn't take that long. It takes another 30 seconds. Okay, there it goes. It's updated. So what should happen now, actually, ideally, so I shouldn't be able to curl Google. Oh, wait, interesting. Oh, this is, maybe it's a bad example. I wonder if I go to CNN.com. Interesting enough, I still can talk to Google, but I can't talk to CNN. That's interesting. I didn't, the poor choice of, so the point is I still don't have internet access. Oh, I don't know what I just did. But I do seem to have access to Google, and in particular, you can also, that was, no, I don't have any buckets, so that's why this command came back with empty, but I can make calls to gsutil, and apparently I can actually open up Google's webpage. Oh, we can't open CNN, but I can actually access Google itself, which is interesting. Okay, so that's what private access does for you. So this is not necessarily ideal because I still can't update my box. So if I try to do an update, install a package or anything on this box, I'm sort of stuck. So I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in here. I'm going to show you an alternative way of doing the same thing, or slightly different, I mean, similar thing. So let me disable this so that turn off this. So I'm basically turning off Google Private Access, and I'm going to enable a different feature. Updating. I'm going to pause, wait till this thing is done. Okay, yeah, it took a second. So now I've got the Google Private Access disabled for this subnet, And again, I cannot go to Google, and I cannot do this. And of course, I can't go to CNN either. Okay, the next feature I'm going to do is, let me leave this running. Switch back to this. So we talked about private access. So now what we can do instead is we can enable something called Cloudnet. It's basically a gateway that where your basically your private instances with only private internal addresses, they can basically when you follow the route to your default route is 0000 to default gateway. Instead of trying to go to the public, the main gateway, internet gateway, it'll actually get automatically routed to a NAT that's in your region. And that NAT will then be able to then translate your address, the network address translation with its own IP address. And when the traffic comes back, it'll then send it back to your box. So what happens here is instead of your GCP instance getting an actual IP address, it can basically just reuse the NAT's IP addresses. So, and then the beauty of this is that you should have access to the internet, you should have access to the Google APIs, but you actually do not have a public IP address or you're not really still reachable from the outside, but you can go outbound, make basically outbound traffic, which is what we're trying to solve here. We're trying to get GCE instance with both access to Google APIs as well as access to the internet itself, but without being accessed by the internet. Okay, so what we'll do is we're just going to go in and enable Cloudnet. So this is under a different menu. This is under Network Services, Cloudnet, and get started. Call this My Gateway. In order to, you have to select a network, right? And then you have to pick a region. So this is a regional resource, right? And I want to point this at where my instance is. So I need to be in Iowa there. Now, in order to make this work, your Cloudnet has to be associated with a regional router. And right now I don't have any routers, so I'm going to push the little wizard to create one. So my router, and leave us all the defaults. Just hit create. Okay, so now I think I'm going to leave all the other defaults, and then I'm going to hit create. Let me pause the video until this gets created. Okay, I'm back. So here's my gateway. It's in US Central 1, and then it's associated with this router. It's running. And then particular importance is that this region is the same region that I'm running my instances in. So now if I go to my instance and I try to go to Google, that worked. Should go to CNN. Oops. Let me clear this. I want to go to CNN. Where's CNN? Of course, I can't find it. There it is. That worked. And then, as you might expect, that works. Okay. Now, so now I'm able to access the internet. And then I guess just to show you that nothing is magic happened. If I go back to Cloud Console to the compute engine, look at this instance. Here, you can still indeed see that this instance has no external IP address, yet I can now use the NAT to basically route my traffic through. And that, I think, is a section on NAT. So the last thing, just a quick thing. When we were creating our instances, I guess I'll just walk through the wizard here. I'll just show you a couple options related to static IP addresses. So if I go to create another instance, I'll still create it in central. I will see under networking, let's see if I can find it. When I was under network interfaces, right? There was an option for internal. There was ephemeral automatic, ephemeral custom, or you can reserve a static IP address, right? And basically you can pick an IP address out of the subnet. It'll basically pick one and you will have a static one, which means every time this instance stops and restarts, it will always have this IP address. If you didn't have a static IP address, every time you stop an instance, it would get a new one potentially on the next startup. No guarantees on that. Now that's how you do internal. On external, likewise, there is also create an IP address, and you can create an IP address, and you can reserve an IP address. And now you will always have that IP address. And that's a public one. So that'll be every time this instance comes up, stopped or not, it will always have this particular IP address and it's public. Okay, so that's how you do public and private static IP addresses. And that's all we're going to cover in this video today.